I didn't expect my whole view on love, age, and second chances to change the day I was called out to fix a leaky garden hose. But by the end of that strange, sun-drenched week in July, I had experienced something I still struggle to describe. Something gentle, complicated, and unforgettable. I was just there to do a quick job, tighten some valves, replace a washer or two. Instead, I found myself sitting in a flower-covered backyard, asked the kind of question that makes your breath catch. "You think I'm too old for love?" She wasn't smiling when she asked. She was serious. And somehow I knew my answer mattered more than I realized. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started like any other Monday. I had 3 jobs lined up, my thermos full of lukewarm coffee, and the usual background noise of talk radio humming from my dashboard. I'd been working solo ever since I quit the big maintenance company too. Years ago, too much paperwork, too little soul. Now it was just me, my tools, and the people I met along the way. Most of the time the work was simple. Broken faucets, worn-out hinges, fences leaning from years of wind and neglect. Yet every so often I got called into someone's life at just the right or wrong moment. And that was when things got complicated. The job ticket was for a place on Hillside Avenue. A quiet stretch of older homes about 10 minutes from the edge of town. I hadn't worked in that neighborhood before, but the name sounded familiar. The message just said, outdoor. Hoses leaking near the base could be the connector. Might need replacing. Ask for Evelyn. No last name, just Evelyn. Pulled up at around 9:40 a.m., already sweating through my t-shirt. The sun was hot early that day and the air felt sticky with the promise of afternoon rain. Her house was the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking. Pale yellow siding, slightly weathered, with an arching oak tree casting scattered shadows across the driveway. Wind chimes tapped softly in the breeze. I knocked twice and waited. No answer. I was just about to ring the doorbell when I heard a voice call out from the side, yard crisp but calm, like someone who hadn't spoken to another adult in a while. "Back here," she said. I followed the sound around a trimmed hedge and found her standing by a coiled green hose. One hand on her hip, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. She was in her early 50s, I guessed, though the gray in. Her hair didn't quite match the strength in her posture. There was something quiet but formidable about her, like an old book you're afraid to open because it might say more than you're ready to hear. "I think it's busted," she said, gesturing to the metal nozzle at the base. "Every time I turn it on, water sprays out like a fountain, not the pretty kind." I crouched down, nodding. "Could be a cracked fitting. I'll check the gasket, too. Might be a simple fix." "Simple sounds nice," she said, and then offered a tired smile before stepping back into the shade. I focused on the task. But I couldn't help noticing little things about her backyard. Rows of clay pots lined the fence, each one brimming with herbs and late summer flowers. A narrow stone path curved through beds of lavender and mint, leading to a small bench tucked beneath a trellis. Wind had blown some petals across the path, and a pair of gardening gloves rested beside an overturned trowel. This wasn't just a backyard, it was someone's sanctuary. And lately I'd been able to tell a lot about people from their gardens. Some were overgrown and wild, full of things left unattended. Others were pristine, too perfect to be enjoyed. But this one felt lived, intended with care, but not controlled. Like its keeper wasn't trying to impress anyone. As I worked, Evelyn watched from a distance. She didn't hover or ask too many questions, but there was a sense that she wanted to say something. Every so often, she opened her mouth, then stopped herself. I finished the inspection and found the culprit, a rusted coupling and a worn-out rubber gasket. Nothing major, but enough to make the hose act up. I had a spare part in the van. When I told her, she just nodded and said, "Take your time. There's iced tea on the table if you want some." That caught me off guard. Clients didn't usually offer drinks, and if they did, it was usually a half-hearted gesture while they stayed busy on their phones. But Evelyn had placed a full pitcher on the glass patio table, along with a second glass, as if she'd planned for someone to sit with her. I replaced the part, tested the hose, and wiped my hands on a rag. Water flowed perfectly. "You're good to go," I said. She stood and clapped softly, a mock cheer. "You might be the first man who fixed something around here without making it worse." I laughed, unsure how to respond. Then she gestured toward the chair opposite hers. "It's for a minute, unless you've got somewhere to be." I hesitated. My next job wasn't for another hour, and something about her tone made it feel like the polite thing to do. I sat. The chair creaked slightly beneath me. The tea was cold, tart, and not overly sweet. It tasted like something homemade, like someone had crushed lemons by hand. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the buzz of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves. I glanced at her. She had that faraway look people get when they're remembering something they haven't talked about in years. "Did you plan all this yourself?" I asked mostly, she said. I started after things got quiet. I didn't press. You learn not to. People will tell you what they need to when they're ready. She looked down at her glass and turned it slowly between her fingers. "It's funny," she said after a while. "You spend years building something with someone, and then suddenly it's just you again. Just you in the garden." I nodded slowly. There was more to her than met the eye, and something told me this wouldn't be my only visit. The first visit should have been the last. I'd fixed the hose, taken a glass of tea, shared a quiet exchange, and even lingered a little longer than usual. But something about the way Evelyn said goodbye stayed with me. She didn't rush it. There was no transactional finality, no casual thanks and door slam. She walked me back to the driveway, her hand trailing across the tops of the lavender as we passed, and she stood by the gate while I packed up my tools. When I said, "Take care," she smiled softly, like she knew we hadn't reached the end of something, just the beginning of something unexpected. And as I drove away, I looked once in the rearview mirror. She was still standing there, one hand on the gate, looking not at me, but at the garden I had just left behind. The next day, it was overcast. I had a no-show client in the morning and a last-minute cancellation in the afternoon, which left me with an awkward block of time and nowhere I really needed to be. I found myself driving in circles, passing through familiar neighborhoods until I realized I was only a few blocks from Hillside Avenue. I told myself it would be polite to check in, make sure the hose was still functioning. Maybe offer to show her how to maintain it for the long run. But the truth was, I wanted to see her. Again, not romantically, not yet. I just had questions in my head that felt incomplete, like she had opened a door in a quiet house and I wasn't sure if I was meant to walk through or just admire it. From the hallway, when I pulled up, she was kneeling in a bed of soil, her gloves streaked with dirt, hair pulled back loosely with a clip. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "Back for more?" she said, her tone light, but her eyes sharp, like she was already trying to read my reason before I even spoke it. I made up. Something about checking the pressure valve, making sure the gasket wasn't slipping. She didn't press me, just nodded and motioned toward the side of the house. As I bent to inspect the hose, I heard her behind me, humming softly, something nostalgic, maybe a tune from the 60s or 70s, broken occasionally by the thud of a trowel or the rustle of roots. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I ended up staying for nearly an hour. She offered lunch and I declined at first, but she made it anyway. Tuna salad on cracked wheat bread, a few cherry tomatoes from the garden, and homemade pickles that tasted like someone's grandmother had whispered the recipe into the jar. We sat again in the same spot, the wind a little cooler this time, and I learned that Evelyn had lived in that house for nearly 20 years. She and her late husband Thomas had moved there after he retired early from teaching. They had no children. He passed away 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, quick and cruel. "He planted the lemon tree," she said, nodding to the corner of the yard. "It still gives fruit, but not as much as it used to. Like it's mourning." 2. There was no self-pity in the way she spoke. Just facts, laid out like an old quilt, squares of memory stitched into the fabric of her life. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't try to fill the silence. That was the thing about Evelyn. She didn't demand words. Oh, she made space for them to arrive naturally if they needed to. That kind of quietness was rare. That week I found myself drifting back to her house more than once. I started helping her with things that weren't technically part of the original job. A loose gate hinge, a broken stepping stone, a cracked planter. She never asked directly, just mentioned them offhandedly, like tossing a stone into a river to see how far it would ripple. I'd pick up a screwdriver or trowel and start working without a word. And in those hours, something formed between us needs attraction exactly, but something gentler. A camaraderie born from shared space and careful timing. Then toward the end of the week, she invited me to help her reattach a trellis that had fallen after a storm. The screws had rusted and one of the beams had split.
Nice.
I brought my tools, and we spent most of the morning trying to brace the structure without damaging the climbing roses. She held the wood while I drilled, her hands steady despite the strain. When it was done, we both stood back and looked at it. The roses clung stubbornly to the lattice, refusing to give up their grip. "Funny," she said quietly. "They keep blooming even when the frame falls apart." She didn't say more, but I heard the metaphor loud and clear. We sat again under the arbor. The shadows had changed since my first visit. They were longer now, softer, like the sun was taking its time, saying goodbye. She poured more tea. Slowly, I was about to leave when she asked if I ever got lonely doing my work alone. I told her the solitude didn't bother me. What bothered me was how rarely people saw each other anymore, really saw each other. Most clients treated me like background noise. But not her. She nodded, then looked off into the distance. After Thomas died, I told myself I didn't need anyone else, that I had enough memories to last me. But memories don't bring you a cup of tea. They don't laugh at your bad jokes. They don't ask how you slept. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and I felt the air shift between us. We didn't speak much after that. I packed up my things, gave her a quiet smile, and walked to the truck. But before I opened the door, she called out to me. I turned, and she was standing on the stone path, one hand resting lightly on the arbor. Her face was unreadable, but her voice was steady. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "So am I replied. I didn't know what was happening yet. I didn't know if this was the beginning of something, or just a fleeting moment of clarity in two separate lives. But I knew I'd be back, not because of work, but because there was something unspoken between us, something growing quietly beneath the surface. It's like roots in soil that hadn't seen rain in years. I didn't tell anyone about Evelyn. Not my brother, not the guy at the supply shop I usually chatted with, not even my landlady who liked to comment on the smallest changes in my routine. It wasn't that I was hiding anything, at least not consciously. It just felt personal, not in a romantic way, not yet, but in the way you hold a delicate object in your hands and instinctively know not to show it off, whatever was happening. Between us, it was forming in the quiet. There were no grand declarations, no flirtation or obvious signals, just gestures, silences, glances that lingered a second too long, and more than anything, sense that we both needed something we couldn't yet name. I came by again the following Tuesday. Under the excuse of checking the hose pressure one more time, I had already replaced the faulty connector, but I told myself it made sense to follow up. Evelyn greeted me with a half smile and a wide-brimmed hat this time. She was barefoot, her toes lightly dusted with soil, and a faint smear of dirt traced her cheek where she must have brushed it without thinking. She looked content, not glamorous or styled, but alive in a way that made everything else in the yard feel like an extension of her. I remember thinking how rare it was to see someone so completely in their element, and how that alone made her seem younger than she probably felt. We spent the morning repotting a collection of succulents. She said had outgrown their containers. I'm not much of a plant person myself, but she handed me gloves and talked me through the process. She told me the names of each plant like they were old friends: Cressella, Sedum, Echeveria. She had a way of saying things that made them feel important. I listened more than I spoke, and when I did say something, it was usually to ask her a question I hadn't meant to ask. Like how she learned so much about gardening, or why she'd stayed in the house all these years after Thomas passed. Always gave me thoughtful answers, sometimes funny, sometimes heavy, and with every answer, I felt like she was letting me just a little closer in. That day, she surprised me with a question of her own, one that seemed harmless at first. She asked if I ever thought about settling down, or if I liked being on my own. I shrugged and said something about freedom, about not being tied down, about how I liked my space. But even as I said it, I realized how much of that was a story I told myself to justify the quiet in my apartment. The empty seat across the dinner table, the silence that greeted me when I came home after a long day. She didn't press the issue, but I saw something in her eyes when I spoke, a recognition. Like she knew the tune, even if the lyrics were different. Later, while wiping her hands on a rag, she mentioned that her friend Marla would be dropping by the next afternoon and asked if I'd be around. I said maybe playing it casual, but I already knew I'd make time. I wasn't sure why she wanted me there when her friend came over. Maybe she just didn't want to be alone. Or maybe she wanted to show me off in some way. Though that felt like a stretch, still I agreed, and we left it at that. I helped her carry the newly potted plants back to the patio, and as I was leaving, she handed me a small envelope. For later, she said. I opened it that evening. Inside was a folded note in neat handwriting. Simply read, "Thank you for reminding me that the garden isn't the only thing still growing." No signature, but she didn't need one. The next day I returned, unsure of what to expect. Friend Marla arrived shortly after I did. A sprightly woman with silver-streaked curls, and a booming voice that filled the backyard with laughter before she even set down her purse. She gave me a once-over, not unkindly, and then turned to Evelyn with a raised brow. "So this is the famous hose man," she said, winking. I chuckled, unsure how to respond, but Evelyn just rolled her eyes and poured iced tea. The three of us talked for a while. Marla had a way of teasing without offending, of poking at the edges of things just enough to make people laugh. She asked about my work, my worst jobs, the strangest things I'd found in basements. She asked if Evelyn had been treating me well, and before I could answer, Evelyn said, "He's been very kind." The way she said it caught me off guard. Kind, not helpful. Not skilled, kind. It landed softly, but stuck. Eventually, Marla took her leave, giving Evelyn a long hug and me a knowing glance. As she backed out of the driveway, she rolled down her window and called out, "Don't let this one slip away. Evie." Evelyn waved her off with a chuckle, but her smile didn't fade for a long while afterward. After Marla left, the mood shifted. The breeze picked up and the garden seemed quieter. We sat again in our usual spots and Evelyn seemed distracted, stirring the ice in her glass, eyes on the distant fence. I asked if she was okay and she nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, "about what it means to start over, about how people think it's a young person's game, new love, new beginnings. But what if it isn't?" Stayed quiet. She wasn't really asking for an answer. She exhaled slowly, then turned to me. Her voice was softer now, almost uncertain. "Do you think I'm too old for love?" There it was, the question. Not wrapped in humor or hidden behind metaphor, but plain and direct. And yet, it felt like the most intimate thing she'd said to me. Looked at her not, just her face, but her posture, her hands, the way she waited. She wasn't fishing for a compliment. She wasn't testing me.
Oh, yes.
She really wanted to know. Like maybe she hadn't even dared to ask herself. I took a breath, trying to find the right words. Not. Just the polite ones, not the automatic response. But something true. "No," I said. "I don't think love cares about age. I think love finds you when you're ready, when you stop pretending you don't need it." At first, she just looked at me, her eyes a little glossy, and nodded. "I used to think I had my one shot," she said finally, "that I got lucky once, and that was it. But lately, I don't know. Lately, I've started wondering if maybe there's a different kind of love waiting. Not the dizzy kind, but the quiet kind, the steady kind." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if she was still speaking to me or just letting thoughts escape before they faded. That evening, I didn't leave right away. We watched the sky shift from gold to gray, the first stars blinking into view like cautious witnesses. And in that hour, sitting next to a woman I barely knew but somehow understood, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected questions are the ones we carry with us, long before we ever ask them out loud. After that evening, something between us shifted not drastically, but subtly, like the tide pulling back ever so slightly before returning stronger. It wasn't about the question she asked, or even the answer I gave. It was the fact that she asked it all, that she let it hang in the air between us with no apology, no shield. Evelyn had invited me into a part of her that most people guard with silence, and I didn't walk away. I didn't laugh or deflect or give her a sugar-coated platitude. Answered like I meant it. So maybe that meant more to her than the words themselves. The next few visits weren't framed around chores. There wasn't a pretense anymore. I wasn't there to fix the hose or patch a fence or replace a bolt. I was just there. She'd leave the side gate unlocked, and I'd show up mid-morning or in the late afternoon, depending on my schedule. Sometimes I brought pastries from the corner bakery. Sometimes she had slices of fresh melon waiting on the patio table. We fell into a rhythm that didn't need definition. Still, we didn't talk about what was happening, not in any concrete terms. It was like we were both afraid to label it too soon, for fear of breaking the fragile thread that connected us. One afternoon, little over a week after the garden hose incident, she invited me inside. I hadn't been beyond the back patio before. The house was just as I'd imagined, sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains. Bookshelves stacked with worn spines and tucked-in photos, a slight scent of lavender and wood polish lingering in the air. Her kitchen was full of life. Copper pans hung from hooks, a bowl of lemons sat on the counter, and a calendar on the fridge had neat, looping handwriting marking birthdays and appointments, though many squares were empty. She brewed coffee while I sat at the breakfast nook, the cushions faded but soft. There was a stillness to the place, not of emptiness, but of waiting. Like the walls remembered laughter and late-night conversations, and were holding their breath for more. She poured us both a cup, then sat across from me, with her fingers wrapped around the mug, her posture relaxed, but her eyes still searching. That day, she asked me about my life before I became a handyman. Most people don't. They assume I've always done this, that I came out of the womb holding a wrench. But Evelyn asked with genuine curiosity, and that changed everything. I told her about the years I spent in construction, about the company that folded when the housing market crashed, about the 3 states I moved through trying to find something that felt stable again. I told her about my father, who taught me how to work with my hands, but never quite taught me how to feel safe standing still. I told her about the long stretches of loneliness I never admitted to anyone, because when you're a man past 30, who knows how to fix a sink and change a tire? People assume you're doing just fine. She listened, not with pity, but with presence. And when I finished, she told me something I hadn't expected, that after Thomas died, she used to go days without speaking to anyone, that the sound of her own voice sometimes startled her, that for a long time she believed her life had narrowed into a single quiet hallway she'd just keep walking down, until the end. But then one day, she decided to plant tomatoes. She didn't know why. She just needed to do something with her hands. And from there, the garden grew, gave her shape. It gave her purpose. That conversation stretched on into the late afternoon. And when I finally stood to leave, she touched my arm lightly, not enough to stop me, but enough to be felt. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, "for listening, for not rushing this." I drove home with the windows down and a strange warmth blooming in my chest. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't infatuation. It was something slower, deeper, like recognition, like coming across a familiar song in a strange place and realizing you know all the words. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying our conversations, her voice, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about her past, the way she looked when sunlight hit her through the window. I wasn't falling for her, I told myself. Not exactly. But I was beginning to see her in color while the rest of the world had started to blur into shades of gray, and that realization carried its own weight. The next day, I returned with no excuse. I knocked on the gate even though it was unlocked, and when she opened it, Her face lit up in a way that told me she had hoped I'd come, but hadn't dared to expect it. She was wearing a loose linen blouse, her hair pinned up carelessly, and her cheeks were dusted with pink from the sun. Oh, she looked real. Beautiful in the way only someone comfortable in their own skin can be. She stepped aside and I entered. Her yard like it was sacred ground. We worked side by side that morning, tending to the soil, trimming herbs, laughing over how wild the mint had gotten. At one point, she brushed dirt from my forearm and laughed when it left a streak instead. I pretended to be offended, and she flicked a basil leaf at me. It landed in my hair. We laughed harder than we should have. And in that moment, the tension that had been slowly building between us shifted again, this time not deeper, but closer. We sat under the arbor afterward, and the silence was full, and not awkward, not heavy, just full, like we both knew something had changed but were too wiser, too scared to name it outright. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of rosemary and cut grass. I looked at her, really looked, and she was already watching me. "You know," she said after a while, her voice almost playful, "you're making it hard to go back to being alone." I smiled, unsure whether to play along or let the weight of her words land. But I didn't have to choose, because in that exact moment, the sky opened. A light drizzle began to fall, gentle but persistent. We didn't move. We let it wash over us. And when she finally stood to get us both inside, she paused halfway, turning back toward me, rain dripping from her hair. "Do you want to stay for dinner?" she asked. It wasn't just a meal she was offering. It was a turning point, an invitation, a line drawn in soft sand. I said yes. The rain didn't let up quickly, but neither of us seemed to mind. She led me through the back door and into her kitchen, where the windows steamed gently from the sudden shift in temperature. I toweled off using a dish rag, laughing at myself as I shook rainwater from my hair. Evelyn handed me a clean shirt and old gray button-down that looked like it had belonged to someone else once, likely Thomas. I hesitated only briefly before slipping it on. It fit better than I expected. She didn't say anything about that, but something flickered in her eyes when she saw me wearing it. It's like a page turning in a book she hadn't planned on reading. Again, dinner was simple. Roasted vegetables, a small portion of baked salmon, some kind of wild rice that tasted faintly of lemon and herbs. We ate at her small dining table, the one by the window that overlooked the garden now glistening in the fading light. It was the first time I had been in that part of the house, and yet it didn't feel unfamiliar. The room was filled with small, curated details candles that had burned down unevenly. A woven basket holding coasters with hand-stitched patterns. A dusty piano tucked into the corner like a quiet guest who preferred to observe. I looked around and saw the life she had built for herself in the aftermath of loss, not frozen in time, but preserved with care. She asked about my past relationships. Not in a prying way, but with the same kind of curiosity she had shown about everything else. I told her about a woman I once lived with for a year, how we tried to build something, but kept returning to different dreams. I admitted that I hadn't let anyone close in a long time, not because I didn't want to, but because the idea of starting again had started to feel more like a gamble than a hope. She nodded, quietly chewing, her eyes on me the whole time, as if trying to see between the words. Then she told me about the time after Thomas passed, when a neighbor tried to set her up with a widower who had just moved into town. They had coffee once. He talked about his golf swing and his dog. She never called him again. It wasn't that he was unkind, she said softly. He just wasn't ready to listen. After we ate, I offered to help with the dishes, and she waved me off at first, but eventually relented. We moved around the kitchen with surprising ease, handing off plates and rinsing utensils without the awkwardness that usually comes from sharing domestic space with someone new. It felt natural, like we had done this before in another life. When we were finished, she poured us both another cup of tea and led me into the living room. The rain had softened outside, but the sound of it tapping on the roof made everything feel more enclosed, more intimate. She lit a candle on the side table and turned off the overhead lights. Bathing the room in amber and shadow, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, legs tucked in, mugs cradled between our hands. For a while, we didn't talk. We just listened to the rain and the occasional creak of the old house settling in for the night. Then she told me about a dream she'd had the week before one, where she was walking through a crowded market, looking for something she couldn't name. In the dream, everyone passed her by, busy and distracted. But one man stopped and handed her a single white flower. She said she remembered waking up with tears in her eyes, not because of the flower, but because of the way he looked at her, like she was still seen. I didn't know what to say to that, not really. But I wanted her to know that I heard it, that I understood, so I asked what kind of flower it was. Like the question itself mattered more than the answer, and whispered camellia. After the tea was gone, and the rain had all but faded to a mist, she stood and walked me to the door. It was late, but not quite night. That in-between hour where the world softens and everything feels a little closer to truth. I stepped outside onto the damp brick path, the air rich with petrichor. She followed, bare feet against the stone, her arms crossed loosely as if hugging herself from the inside out. I turned to say goodbye, and she didn't move. She just looked at me, not expectant, not hopeful, just present. "I'm glad you stayed," she said finally. "So am I," I replied, echoing the words I'd said once before, now heavier with meaning. We didn't touch. There was no embrace, no long-held gaze, no lingering moments stolen from a movie scene. Just a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was unfolding exactly as it needed to. I walked to my truck, started the engine, and waited until I saw her silhouette disappear behind the front door before pulling away. That night, sleep came slowly. My mind drifted back over every word, every pause, every detail I hadn't noticed in real time. The scent of her cooking, the warmth of the borrowed shirt, the way she had said the word camellia like it held some private truth. I wasn't sure what was happening between us, and yet I didn't feel the need to name it. It was enough to feel it, to show up, to be seen. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. I brewed coffee, stared out the window of my apartment, and realized how quiet my space was without her presence, echoing somewhere in the corners of it. I found myself wondering what she was doing, whether she'd slept well, whether she'd remember that she had invited me to stay without ever needing to ask again. I spent most of the day working on another job, a leaky pipe under an old farmhouse a few miles out of town, but my thoughts kept drifting. That evening, I stopped by her house again, this time unannounced. She didn't seem surprised. She opened the gate before I even knocked and motioned me in with a soft smile. "I was just thinking about baking something," she said. "Hope you like banana bread." We spent the evening baking and talking about nothing and everything. She told me stories from her college days, how she once got locked out of her dorm wearing nothing but a towel. I told her about a time I dropped a client's antique mirror while trying to hang it and had to scramble to find a replacement before they got home. We laughed until our sides hurt. And in those moments of shared laughter, I realized something that hit me deeper than I expected. I hadn't laughed like that in years, not with anyone. When the banana bread was done, she cut 2 thick slices, buttered them, and handed me a plate. We ate on the back steps, legs dangling off the edge, the night air cool against our skin. Above us, the stars emerged one by one, scattered like breadcrumbs across the dark. She leaned her head against the frame of the door and closed her eyes. I watched her in silence, my chest heavy with something I couldn't name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something warm and familiar and good. Something that had been missing for so long, I almost didn't recognize it. Maybe it was the start of love. Or maybe it was something even rarer. The rediscovery of companionship, trust, and the quiet joy of being known. I didn't stay late. That night, when I stood to leave, she didn't walk me out, didn't hover or hesitate. She just looked up at me, her eyes steady, her voice gentle. "The same time tomorrow?" she asked. I nodded, and without another word, I walked into the night, knowing I would return. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. Out of something beginning to bloom between us, something neither of us had dared to expect, but were both willing to see through. The next morning, I arrived at Evelyn's place a little earlier than usual, not because we had planned anything in particular, but because the thought of being there gave my day a kind of purpose I hadn't felt in a long Time. It was a quiet feeling, not adrenaline, not obsession, but something deeper, something that calmed me even as it stirred me. The kind of anticipation that sits in your chest like a soft pulse, reminding you that you're moving toward something that matters. The gate was open when I got there, as if she had known I'd come. I stepped into the garden and found her kneeling near the hydrangeas, her hands deep in soil, her back to me. I didn't want to startle her, so I stood still for a moment and just watched. The morning sun caught her hair in a way that made it seem lighter, like it was glowing. The back of her blouse was speckled with dirt, and her gardening gloves were already stained from work. She looked more herself in that moment than in any other I had seen her, rooted, focused, unbothered by time. When she finally noticed me, she looked up with a soft grin and motioned toward a small pile of terracotta pots. "I was hoping you'd show," she said. "These need repotting, and I was waiting for my assistant." Her teasing tone wasn't flirtatious. It was familiar, like we had shared a lifetime's worth of mornings like this before. I knelt beside her without a word, and we worked together. In the soil, the silence between us as comforting as any conversation. She talked about the hydrangeas as we worked, how they changed color based on the pH level in the soil, how each one seemed to have its own personality. I nodded, listening, even though I didn't know much about plants, but I loved hearing her speak about them. There was something tender in the way she described each bloom, something loving in how she touched their leaves. It made me wonder how many things in her life had been cared for in this same quiet, patient way. After we finished, she suggested we take a walk to the park nearby, something she said she hadn't done in months. She disappeared inside to grab a sweater while I waited under the arbor, wiping the dirt from my hands with a rag. When she came back out, she looked different, nothing dramatic. But there was a softness to her posture, a brightness in her eyes that felt new. We walked side by side down the sidewalk, the early sunlight casting long shadows ahead of us. She told me about how she and Thomas used to walk this same path every Sunday morning, sometimes holding hands, sometimes in silence. It wasn't a sad story, just a memory. She shared it like one might describe a favorite painting, something beautiful. From a time that no longer needed to hurt, the park was quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers passing through. We found a bench under a jacaranda tree, its blossoms beginning to fall in delicate purple clusters that speckled the grass like confetti from a forgotten celebration. We sat there for a long time, just watching people go by. A little girl ran past us chasing bubbles, her laughter echoing like wind chimes. Evelyn smiled, her eyes following the girl for a few seconds before turning back toward the path. "Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if your life had gone a different way?" she asked, not looking at me. I thought for a moment before, answering, all the time. But I've learned not to stay in those thoughts too long. They don't change much. They just distract you from what's still possible. She nodded slowly, the corners of her mouth turning up in agreement. "Still possible?" she repeated softly, like the words had weight. We spent the rest of the morning wandering through the park, stopping occasionally to admire a tree or read the plaques on the benches. She told me stories about people she used to know, places she'd always wanted to visit, and books that had changed her way of seeing the world. I listened more than I spoke, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to remember every detail. I wanted to be the kind of person who remembered what mattered to her as we made our way back to her house. A soft breeze picked up, stirring the petals that had gathered on the sidewalk. She reached for my arm, not out of necessity, but out of instinct, and held it lightly as we walked. It was the first time we'd touched outside of a handshake or a passing graze, and even though it was small, it stayed with me. I don't remember what we talked about on the way home. I just remember the feeling of her hand on my arm and the sound of her voice blending with the wind. That evening, she invited me to stay for dinner again. This time I helped cook. She handed me a cutting board and a knife, and we prepared the meal like two people who had done this before. It felt seamless, comfortable, like the kitchen had adjusted to our presence together. Afterward, we ate in the garden under the string lights she had looped along the fence. The sun had dipped below the trees, and the sky was painted in strokes of lavender and gold. She poured us each a glass of wine, and for a moment we sat in silence. clinking glasses with a quiet toast that needed no words. You know, she said eventually, I used to think that after a certain age life would stop surprising me. And now? I asked. She looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled. Now I think maybe the best parts are still ahead. That night I left later than usual, and I stood to go. She didn't walk me to the door, as she just sat there under the lights, her legs tucked under her, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, and a look on her face that I still carry with me. A look that said she was letting herself hope again, even if just a little. And that maybe, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to do it alone. As I drove home, the streets empty and quiet, I thought about what it meant to be surprised by life. I had always assumed that kind of surprise was reserved for the young, for those still chasing firsts. But maybe it wasn't about age at all. Maybe it was about timing, about readiness, about the right kind of presence showing up at just the right moment. And in that quiet space between thought and certainty, I realized that whatever was growing between Evelyn and me, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a season neither of us had expected, but were both slowly learning how to embrace. The following week unfolded in a way that felt unspokenly intentional. We didn't text, didn't call, didn't make formal plans. And yet, each day I found myself carving out time to pass by Evelyn's house. Sometimes in the late morning, sometimes right before sunset, but always with the same sense of grounding. Her presence was no longer just comforting. It had become something that steadied me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. It was like my life had been moving at a quiet hum, and now someone had tuned it just right. I wasn't rushing toward anything, but I was showing up with purpose, even if that purpose was simply being seen. One afternoon, I arrived to find her sitting beneath the shade of the arbor, a book open on her lap and a small notebook balanced on the armrest beside her. She looked up when she saw me, her expression softening into a smile that made me feel like I belonged right there. In that moment, in that garden beside her, without a word, she gestured to the chair across from her, and I took the seat as if it had been waiting for me. We sat in silence for a while, a quiet hum of bees and the distant call of birds filling the space between us. Eventually, she closed her book and folded her hands in her lap. I've been writing again, she said, her voice thoughtful, as if she wasn't sure whether to share that detail. Just little reflections, things I notice, thoughts I forget to speak aloud. I nodded, intrigued but not wanting to push. I could see the vulnerability just beneath the surface of her calm, and I knew better than to crowd it. After a moment, she picked up her notebook and opened it to a page marked by a pressed leaf. Her fingers hovered above the paper before she handed it to me. This one's about last Tuesday, she said quietly. I took the notebook gently and began to read. Her handwriting was delicate and elegant, with small curls at the ends of letters and careful spacing. She had written about the banana bread, about the way we'd laughed, about the sound of my voice when I told her about the mirror I had broken. But it wasn't just the events she'd captured, it was the feeling, the warmth, the lightness, the way time had felt suspended just for a little while. She ended the entry with a line that sat in my chest like an anchor. It's strange how quickly presence can turn into comfort. How quickly comfort becomes missed, even before it's gone. I closed the notebook and looked up at her. She met my gaze with that same quiet openness, the kind that didn't demand a response but invited one anyway. I said, meaning every word. She didn't smile right away. Instead, she nodded and looked down at her hands, as if bracing herself against her own honesty. I didn't realize how much I missed sharing these little things with someone until I started writing them again. That admission landed heavier than I expected. Not because it was sad, but because it was true in a way I deeply understood. For so long, I had walked through life with pockets full of small moments, thoughts, observations, jokes that had no one to land with. I knew exactly what it meant to crave a witness to the seemingly insignificant. We spent the rest of that day tending to the back section of the garden, where the jasmine had started creeping a little too wildly along the fence. She handed me shears while she tied up the more delicate vines, humming quietly to herself as she worked. The air smelled sweet and earthy, and every so often, she would pause to show me something, an insect she hadn't seen before. sprout she hadn't planted that had somehow taken root anyway. It felt like a metaphor neither of us needed to name. Afterward, we sat on the porch steps, sipping iced tea and letting the quiet stretch long between us. The sun dipped low, casting a golden hue across her lawn, and I could feel the inevitable weight of evening approaching. She leaned back on her hands and glanced over at me, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking about what I asked you," she said suddenly, the words hanging in the air like a returning echo. I didn't need her to explain. I remembered it as clearly as if it had happened that morning, her standing in the sun, her fingers lightly damp from the hose, the vulnerability in her voice when she asked if I thought she was too old for love. She looked out toward the garden as she continued, her tone softer now. "I wasn't just asking about me. I think I was asking about the idea, the belief that after a certain point, you just stop being seen, stop being wanted, that love has a shelf life." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to, but something told me that what she needed in that moment wasn't words, was space. So I waited. She reached down and plucked a stray leaf from the edge of the step, turning it between her fingers. "I used to believe love was about the big things. Fireworks, declarations, all-consuming passion," she said. "But lately, I've started to wonder if it's more about the small things. The way someone shows up. The way they laugh with you when no one else is around." Still, I stayed silent, letting her give voice to something that had clearly been circling her thoughts for days. She finally looked at me then, her eyes clearer than they'd been in a long time. "I think what scares me isn't being too old for love. It's realizing I might have just started understanding it, that broke something open in me. Not because I had an answer, but because I had felt the same thing, just in different words. I had built my life around tasks, around usefulness, around doing. But here with her, I was beginning to feel the unfamiliar beauty of simply being seen, being known, being chosen not because of what I could fix, but because of what I made her feel when I was near. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped slightly, but neither of us moved. We stayed on those steps long after the light had faded. The only sound around us the soft hum of evening insects and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a declaration. It was a pause, a moment, suspended between what we were and what we might become. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of quiet urgency, the kind that doesn't stir panic, but instead gently reminds you that something meaningful is unfolding, and you do well not to miss it. I had spent so many years moving from job to job, town to town, never quite letting roots take hold. But now, each day started with thoughts of Evelyn, not as a fantasy, not as a possibility, but as a grounding truth. There was something about our time together that made even the mundane feel charged with presence. Fixing a broken planter in her yard or sitting in silence over tea didn't feel like filler, it felt like the whole point. When I pulled up to her house, I noticed the gate was closed for the first time in days. It's not locked, just gently resting against the post, as if marking a boundary that needed acknowledgement. I paused before opening it, uncertain if today would feel different. As I stepped through and walked up the stone path, I found her on the porch. A wool shawl around her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked peaceful but distant, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the trees. I stood there, for a moment, unsure if I should say anything, until she turned to me and smiled small. "Sincere and just a little tired. I almost texted you to come later," she said softly. But then I realized part of me wanted you here before I could talk myself out of it. I didn't ask questions. I didn't probe. I just sat down beside her and waited. She sipped her coffee slowly before setting the mug down beside her. Eyes scanned the yard, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "Last night I dreamed of Thomas," she said, not looking at me. He was standing at the edge of the garden, just watching. Not sad, not angry, just still. Like he wanted me to know he was okay with me moving forward. Or maybe I just needed him to say that, even if only in a dream. I nodded gently, letting the weight of her words settle between us. Grief has a way of folding itself into new forms over time. It becomes quieter, yes, but also more complex. It doesn't vanish, it transforms, reshaping how you move through the world. I could tell this wasn't about missing Thomas as much as it was about giving herself permission to live beyond him. I don't feel guilty, she continued after a long pause. But I do feel unsure, like I'm holding two truths in my hands and not sure how to carry them both. I loved him. I'll always love him. And yet, I'm beginning to feel something different, something new, something that doesn't erase what came before, but adds to it. She finally turned to look at me, her expression bare. Do you know what I mean? I did. Completely. Because I had spent most of my adult life thinking love was linear, that one story ended and a new one began cleanly, without overlap. But now, sitting beside her, I realized that love is more like a patchwork. Each person you care for adds a stitch, a layer, a texture. And eventually, the fabric becomes something you carry. Something that keeps you warm, even as the shapes and colors change. You don't have to choose between them, I said. Your past and your present, they're both part of your story. Her eyes softened, not in relief, but in recognition. We didn't talk much after that. Instead, we spent the morning tending to the garden with a kind of reverent quiet. She pruned the roses while I replaced a few cracked stepping stones that led to the shed. The work was slow, methodical, almost meditative. Every motion felt intentional, as if the physical tasks were helping her sort through the emotional ones. And maybe they were doing the same for me too. Later, we ate lunch on the porch, slices of tomato and mozzarella with basil from her own garden, drizzled with olive oil. The sun had reached its highest point, casting everything in a golden glow. She looked more at ease now. The heaviness of the morning softened into something manageable. She asked about my family, and I told her about my younger sister who lived 2 states away, about how we used to build tree forts and pretend we were explorers when we were kids. She laughed at that, then shared her own stories about summer road trips with Thomas and their 2 boys, who now lived in opposite corners of the country with families of their own. It struck me how often our conversations returned to memories, not because we were clinging to the past, but because they helped us map out who we had become. Every story we shared was like a brick in the bridge we were building between us. And with each one, the distance closed just a little more. As the afternoon wore on, she invited me inside to help her bring down some boxes from the attic. Old keepsakes, she said. I've been meaning to sort through them, and I thought maybe it would be easier with someone else around. The attic was small, but surprisingly well kept. Dust danced in the shafts of light coming through the narrow window, and the air smelled faintly of cedar. We opened the first box together, revealing a collection of photo albums, children's artwork, and worn-out letters tied with ribbon. She picked up one envelope carefully and smiled at the handwriting. This was the first letter Thomas ever wrote me, she said, handing it to me. He left it under my windshield wiper after our 3rd date. I read it silently, careful not to intrude too deeply, but struck by how thoughtful and earnest the words were. There was a gentleness in the way Thomas wrote, a kind of vulnerability that echoed what I'd seen in Evelyn. I handed it back with a nod, and she placed it gently into a pile she labeled Keep. We went through 2 more boxes that afternoon, laughing at some of the old clothes, tearing up over photos that captured forgotten moments. But the most poignant thing wasn't the items themselves. It was the way she let me into them, into her past, into the stories behind the smiles and scribbles. She wasn't just sharing objects. She was sharing herself. When we came back downstairs, she seemed lighter, like the process of remembering had cleared space for something new to take root. We sat on the couch with glasses of lemonade and for a while said nothing, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then somewhere in the quiet, she looked at me and said, I think I'm learning how to carry him with me, not behind me. It was a simple statement, but it landed like a revelation, Love, real love, doesn't always ask you to leave the past behind. Sometimes it just asks you to carry it differently, to hold it gently while you reach for what's next. That evening, as I left her house and stepped back out into the crisp air, I felt the shape of something beginning to form inside me. Not just hope, not just attraction, but a kind of reverence for her, for what we were building, for the timing of it all. And I realized I wasn't just helping her rediscover what love might still mean. She was doing the same for me. The following days moved with a kind of quiet rhythm. I didn't see Evelyn every day, but somehow her presence lingered in everything. I'd find myself noticing the way sunlight hit the side of a building, or the way the smell of rain hung in the air after a sudden shower. It would make me think of her porch, of the jasmine winding up her fence, of the way she leaned back in her chair and squinted into the light when she was thinking deeply. I had lived so long without anyone occupying that much space in my day-to-day awareness that the change felt both gentle and seismic. I didn't fight it. I let it in like I might let in a breeze. Gradual, natural, refreshing. When I did stop by again, it was late in the afternoon. The sun had already begun to lower itself toward the horizon, casting long golden slants through the trees. Her house was quiet, but the gate was open. I let myself in and walked toward the backyard, expecting to find her in her usual spot under the arbor. Instead, I heard the soft strains of an old song drifting from inside the house. Something soulful, the kind of music that makes you stop and feel, even if you don't recognize the lyrics. She opened the door before I could knock, already smiling as if she had sensed me approaching. She was wearing a loose sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a soft braid that rested against her collarbone. There was something incredibly homey about her in that moment, as if she wasn't just opening her door to a visitor, but welcoming someone back into something shared. "I'm making soup," she said simply, stepping aside to let me in. The kind that takes forever but is always worth the wait. Her kitchen smelled like rosemary and garlic, and something slightly sweet I couldn't place. I offered to help, and she handed me a wooden spoon without a word, like it was the most natural thing in the world. We moved around the kitchen without pretense, stirring, chopping, taste testing like people who had cooked together for years. Every moment felt unhurried. Every silence was companionable. When she spoke, it was to tell me about a book she had just finished, or a dream she couldn't quite shake. Listened and responded, but mostly I just soaked her in. Her presence was like a kind of music, low, steady, always playing in the background. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where she had lit a few candles, their flames flickering softly against the windows. She brought out a small photo album I hadn't seen before, this one newer, with more recent photos, her sons, her grandkids, her garden, in different seasons. She handed it to me and curled up in the armchair across from me, her legs tucked. Beneath her, a throw blanket draped over her lap. "Sometimes I forget how full my life has been," she said. "I get so focused on what's missing now that I overlook what's already here." I nodded, flipping through the pages. The photos told the story of a life lived fully, not without loss, but with resilience. I saw pictures of birthday parties and quiet mornings in the garden, of travel snapshots with handwritten notes in the margins, of her with Thomas always smiling, always side by side. I could tell how much love had been held in those years. I could also tell how much of it still lingered in the corners of her home, in the softness of her words, in the way she looked at the people she cared about, even when they weren't in the room anymore. When I closed the album, she looked at me differently, not with hesitation or uncertainty, but with a kind of quiet evaluation, as if she was measuring what it meant to let someone new into a life already so deeply layered. "I keep wondering," she said after a long pause, "if it's fair to ask someone to join me at this stage. With all the chapters already written, with all the things I can't start fresh." I leaned forward, setting the album gently on the coffee table. "Maybe love isn't about starting fresh. Maybe it's about continuing well." She smiled at that, and for a moment we just sat there, the space between us narrowing in a way that didn't need movement to feel close. I didn't reach for her. I didn't push for anything more than what was already being shared. And yet, something shifted. An understanding. A silent agreement that this was no longer just friendship, no longer just companionship. It was something becoming. The next time I came by, it was raining. Soft, steady rain that painted the world in silver. I found her standing just inside the threshold of her back door, watching the water run down the glass. She turned when she heard me and opened the door without a word. I stepped inside and closed it behind me, shaking droplets from my jacket. "You came anyway," she said quietly, handing me a towel. "Of course I did," I replied, and she didn't. Need me to say more? We sat on the floor of her sunroom, watching the rain. She brought out an old record player and played Billie Holiday, the scratches on the vinyl making the music feel even older, more lived in. The moment was still, suspended, and I found myself watching her more than the storm. The way she closed her eyes at certain parts, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the fabric of her pants in rhythm, the way she leaned her head back and let herself just be. And I thought, this is what it means to fall for someone not in a flash, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in the quiet accumulation of moments. In soup made slowly, in photo albums shared freely. Lets you sit beside her without needing to speak. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, it was growing. As the rain continued to fall and the sky darkened, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever get scared of how fast things can change?" I thought for a moment before answering. I think change is always happening, we just notice it more. When it's something good, 'cause suddenly we're afraid to lose it. She nodded, her eyes locking with mine, and in that quiet, shared understanding, the fear didn't feel quite so big. Not because it disappeared, but because it had been acknowledged, spoken into the air between us, and met with gentleness. And as the rain softened into mist, and the night crept closer, we stayed there, two people learning how to carry both the past and the future together. The days that followed felt like they belonged to a different kind of calendar, one that didn't measure time by hours or deadlines, but by the rhythm of togetherness. Mornings that began with her name on my mind, afternoons punctuated by the sound of wind chimes outside her porch, evenings that ended with the memory of her voice lingering softly in my thoughts. It wasn't about being in love, not in the dramatic sense the world often insists on. It was something subtler, more rooted, like we were rediscovering how to live gently beside someone, not needing to be anything but present. Evelyn invited me over one Saturday with a suggestion that we finally tackle her cluttered garage, a mess decades in the making. She'd said over the phone with a laugh that hinted at both dread and fondness. When I arrived, she was already pulling boxes onto the driveway, her hair pulled into a ponytail, a smudge of dust across her cheek, and a kind of excited chaos in her movement. I grabbed a pair of gloves from the truck and joined her without hesitation. We spent hours sifting through time, old holiday decorations with faded glitter, boxes of her son's elementary school art projects, mismatched dishes from a yard sale. She had once planned to use 4 garden parties, but never quite got around to hosting. She narrated each item like a storyteller paging through a book she hadn't read in years, letting the story surface, sometimes laughing, sometimes falling, into quiet reflection. I found an old radio, still intact, and she beamed as I plugged it in. Static at first, and then the low hum of a jazz station filled the space between us. And just like that, the garage became something more than a dusty turret, became a capsule of memory and mood. Midway through, we found a large wooden chest she had nearly forgotten about. It took both of us to carry it outside. Inside were items far more personal, handwritten letters, old calendars with events circled in red ink, dried flowers pressed into dated notebooks, and a small velvet box that she didn't open right away. Instead, she let her fingers rest gently on the lid, staring down at it as though it might whisper something if she stayed still long enough. "That was my engagement ring from Thomas," she said after a pause, almost as if the words had to be coaxed out. "He didn't have much back then, bought it with borrowed money and so much hope. I haven't opened it since the day after his funeral." I stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. She opened the box slowly, revealing a delicate ring, the stone modest, the metal worn from time, but still shining faintly in the sunlight. She looked at it with eyes that didn't weep, but that carried the fullness of memory. Then, after a moment, she closed the lid again, not with sorrow, but with a kind of respectful closure. She smiled at me then, not the bright kind she gave during small talk, but one that seemed to come from a deep and steady place, I think. I needed to do that with someone here, with someone who could understand that this ring isn't about endings. It's about honoring what shaped me. That night, after the garage was clean and the boxes labeled, we sat on the back porch again. The sky above us filled with stars barely visible between the tree branches. She had a blanket wrapped around her legs, and I brought out 2 cups of warm cider she had brewed earlier. The quiet between us had taken on a new texture. It wasn't just peaceful, it was intimate. It was the kind of quiet that lives only between people who have seen each other's vulnerable corners and still choose to stay. She looked at me after a long stretch of silence and asked,
Kate,
"Do you ever worry that we might be misreading all of this? That maybe we're clinging to companionship because we're both a little lonely?" I thought about it, not because I doubted her question, but because I respected it. "I think loneliness teaches you to be careful," I said finally. "What we have doesn't feel like desperation. It feels like attention. We pay attention to each other. And that kind of presence doesn't come from emptiness. It comes from knowing what matters." She let those words sink in, then reached across the space between us to rest her hand over mine. It was the first time we had touched like that deliberately, directly. Her fingers were warm, soft, and steady. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let that connection pass through me like heat from a long-waited fire. The moon had risen higher by the time we said goodnight. I didn't kiss her, and she didn't ask me to stay. But something had shifted. Something that made the goodnight feel less like a pause and more like a promise. The next few days were a mixture of normalcy and quiet anticipation. I went about my other work projects, but with a part of my mind always half there at Evelyn's house. I started fixing up the front porch railing, replacing splintered wood and repainting the posts. I didn't even wait for her to ask. I just wanted to do it. Every stroke of the paintbrush felt like an offering, a wordless way to say, "I care. I notice. I'm still here." One morning, as I was packing up my tools, she brought out a small wrapped parcel. It was a sketch pad, leather-bound, with my initials pressed into the corner. "I saw it at the bookstore and thought of you," she said, almost shyly. "You're always telling stories. Thought you might try writing some of them down?" Took me a moment to find the words. No one had given me something that thoughtful in a long time, maybe ever. I took the notebook and turned it over in my hands. "Thank you," I said, but the words didn't feel big enough. She smiled and shrugged. "It's just paper." But we both knew it wasn't. It was recognition. It was encouragement. It was her way of saying, "I see you beyond what you fix and build and carry." That evening, as I sat in my truck outside her house, I opened the notebook and wrote my first entry. Not about tools or fences or garden hoses, but about Evelyn. About how love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or declarations. Sometimes it shows up in soup, in rainstorms, in garage cleanouts, in cider under the stars. Sometimes it arrives with a softness so quiet you only recognize it by the way it steadies your hands. And as I looked back toward the glow of her windows, I felt something settle inside me. Not certainty, not conclusion, but clarity. This wasn't just a chapter, it was a beginning. The following week felt like a gentle exhale. Life didn't suddenly become cinematic or full of dramatic turns, but rather it moved with a sense of steadiness that felt earned. I still had other jobs lined up: porch repairs, gate adjustments, an old man who needed help rewiring his workshop, but each morning felt anchored by the thought of Evelyn. Not just as a woman I was growing close to, but as someone whose presence now felt like part of my internal rhythm. I would notice small things and think of her how the morning light looked brushing across a row of hanging wind chimes, or how certain flowers near a client's fence reminded me of the ones blooming outside her bedroom window. She was becoming part of the way I experienced the world. That realization didn't scare me. It calmed me. When I returned to her house, on a quiet Thursday morning, the sky was thick with early fog, casting everything in a soft haze. Evelyn was in the front yard, already trimming her hedges, her sweater sleeves rolled up and a smear of soil across one cheek. I admired the way she moved with quiet confidence, the way she looked so rooted in her space, like she was part of the landscape. She glanced up when she saw me and smiled, her eyes warming with familiarity. We didn't say much at first. She just handed me a pair of gloves and we got to work. It was that kind of morning, the kind where the silence didn't ask to be, filled where shared tasks felt like a language of their own. After a while, she broke the silence with a soft, almost amused voice. "Do you ever think we're too comfortable with silence?" I looked over at her, the question not catching me off guard, but rather opening a door I hadn't realized we'd left ajar. I took a moment before answering. I think comfort isn't something to be suspicious of, I said. Most people spend their whole lives chasing it. If we found it, even for a while, I think that's something to be grateful for. She considered that, then nodded, as if giving herself permission to believe it too. We worked through the fog and into the late morning, stopping only when the sun began to break through the clouds. She made coffee, and we sat on the steps of the back porch, sipping quietly as the warmth crept into the day. She leaned her shoulder against mine, not in a way that begged attention, but in the way someone leans when they know you'll hold your place, and I did. I stayed still, letting the closeness speak louder than any conversation could. Later, she brought up an idea she'd been mulling over. "I've been thinking about getting away for a weekend. It's just somewhere close to a bed and breakfast near the coast. I haven't been out of town in years." I turned to her intrigued. "Alone?" I asked, curious about her intention. She shrugged, looking down at her mug. I was going too, but then I thought, what? Maybe it wouldn't hurt to have someone with me. Someone I trust. Someone who's become part of my story. Her words were deliberate but vulnerable, the kind that come from a place of hope, tempered by caution. I felt something stir, in me not excitement exactly, but something deeper, a recognition of what this could become, a quiet step into something more. "I'd like that," I said, and the simplicity of my response felt right. I didn't make elaborate plans. We didn't rush to book anything, but the seed had been planted, and we both knew something new was taking root. That weekend, I brought over a book I'd been meaning to lend her. It was a collection of short stories by a writer we'd mentioned in passing, someone whose words held the same softness and truth that Evelyn seemed drawn to. She welcomed me in with a gentle smile, already in her reading chair, a blanket over her lap, and a second cup of tea waiting for me on the table beside her. We spent the afternoon reading in near silence, each of us lost in our own pages, but comforted by the presence of the other. Every so often she would chuckle at a line or sigh softly, and I would glance up, grateful for the quiet companionship. When evening came, we made a simple dinner, roasted vegetables and baked fish, and ate by the glow of a few scattered candles. The radio played softly in the background, the kind of slow jazz that drapes itself over a room like a warm coat. And then, without planning it, without fanfare, she stood and held out her hand. "Dance with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood, took her hand, and let her guide me to the center of the room. We moved slowly, swaying more than dancing, her cheek resting lightly against my shoulder. I held her carefully, the way you hold something delicate but strong. The world outside faded. The past, the questions, even the uncertainty about what came next, all of it fell away. In that moment, there was only us, and the quiet music and the way our bodies fit together like they had always meant to. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching mine. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she said. "Not just the closeness, the safety, the belief that maybe I'm not too late for something beautiful." I reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're not late," I said. "You're exactly where you need to be. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to." The moment was already full. A kiss would have been punctuation, and we weren't ready for the sentence to end. Instead, we returned to our chairs, sipping the last of our tea, and let the night wrap around us like a soft quilt before I left. She walked me to the door and paused, her hand resting lightly on my chest. "You bring something into this house," she said. "Something I didn't realize I'd been missing. Not noise, not change. Just come." I didn't respond right away. I just leaned in slightly, resting my forehead against hers for a long, still moment. And then I stepped out into the night. The air cool but not cold. The sky above, clear and bright. I looked back once, saw her silhouette framed in the doorway, and smiled. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was anxious, but because my mind kept replaying the dance, the look in her eyes, the way the space between us no longer felt like a gap, but like a shared breath. I opened the notebook she had given me and wrote again, not about her, but about us. About how sometimes love arrives softly without pretense or noise, asks only to be noticed. And I was noticing with every step, every glance, every shared silence. I was noticing. The days that followed were quieter. Not because anything was wrong, because we had entered that tender space between two people where presence began to mean more than action. Evelyn and I didn't need to speak every day or plan elaborate moments. What we shared had found its own quiet rhythm, slow dance that didn't demand spectacle, but instead unfolded gently, like the soft turning of pages in a well-worn book. I found myself humming as I worked at other homes, a small smile lingering at the corners of my mouth when I thought of her, of our porch conversations, of the way she now reached for my hand without hesitation when we walked side by side. Something between us had shifted permanently, though neither of us had named it aloud. We didn't rush to label this bond. We simply let it grow. One late morning, after wrapping up a job across town, I drove past Evelyn's neighborhood. I hadn't planned to stop, but as I passed her street, a gentle pull guided me to her driveway like gravity. Her car was there, the garden freshly watered, the wind chimes above the porch dancing softly in the breeze. I rang the doorbell, and when she opened the door, her face lit up in that way that made the world slow down for a moment. She wore a loose cardigan, her hair loosely gathered with a pencil stuck through the knot like an afterthought. Like home. Without needing to ask why I'd come, she stepped aside. And I entered as naturally as if I had always belonged there. We spent that afternoon sorting through her kitchen drawers. It had started as a joke, her claiming that every junk drawer in America was secretly the same paper clips, expired coupons, and unidentified keys, and I challenged her to prove it. We emptied them one by one onto the counter, laughing as we unearthed old batteries, dried-out pens, buttons from jackets she no longer owned, and a postcard from a friend she hadn't seen in over a decade. Each object told a story, and as we sifted, it became less about organizing and more about rediscovery. We talked about the things we tend to keep, not because we need them, but because they remind us of who we were once, tiny anchors to the past, tucked away in corners we rarely look at. At some point, she pulled out a folded piece of paper that made her pause. I watched her face change, the corners of her mouth softening, her gaze turning inward. She handed it to me wordlessly. It was a note written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. A letter from her late husband, Thomas. Just a few lines. A reminder for her to pick up milk, followed by a scribbled heart and the words "love you," even when you forget the list. It was mundane and beautiful all at once, the kind of intimacy built over decades. I handed it back to her gently, and she folded it with the same care one might give to a fragile photograph. She didn't cry, but her eyes shimmered with something I recognized, not grief exactly, but reverence. She slipped the note into a small wooden box on a shelf above the stove. Some things, she whispered, don't need to be let go of to make space for new things. They just need to find the right place. We sat outside afterward, 2 mugs of chamomile tea warming our hands, as the late sun painted everything in a golden wash. She was quieter than usual, but it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like reflection. I gave her the space she needed, sipping my tea and watching the way the breeze moved through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of rosemary and lilac. After a long stretch of silence, she turned to me and said, "Do you believe in second chances?" Her voice was low, almost cautious. I nodded. "I think life is full of them," I said. We just don't always recognize them when they arrive in smaller packages. She smiled faintly, then reached for my hand. This feels like one. Her words weren't heavy with need or uncertainty. They carried clarity, a quiet conviction that settled into my chest like warmth. I didn't speak, I just nodded, intertwining my fingers with hers. That weekend, we took the drive to the bed and breakfast near the coast, a modest place nestled along the edge of a sleepy shoreline, with weathered shutters and hand-painted signs. It's the kind of spot that didn't try to impress but simply offered rest. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sky low and gray with the scent of rain clinging to the air. Evelyn checked us in with practiced grace, and we were led to a small cottage tucked beneath the shadow of an old cedar tree. The cottage had a single bed, which neither of us commented on at first. We moved around the space like respectful travelers, careful not to assume too much. She unpacked a book and a shawl. I set my bag beside the dresser and opened a window to let in the sea air. The silence was comfortable, but charged with something new. That night, after a quiet dinner at a small cafe nearby, we returned to the cottage and sat side by side on the porch. Watching the tide roll in beneath a sliver of moonlight, she leaned her head against my shoulder, and I wrapped an arm around her. We didn't speak much, but everything was said. When we turned in for the night, she moved toward the bed and paused, her hand resting lightly on the quilted blanket. She looked back at me, not with hesitation, but with honesty. You don't have to stay if it feels too soon. I crossed the room slowly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. We lay down. Side by side, not tangled in passion, but resting in the gentle knowledge that trust had brought us here. Sleep came slow but sweet, wrapped in the comfort of nearness. In the morning, we woke before the sun, the sky still tinted with violet and blue. I watched her sleep for a while, the rise and fall of her breath, the way her hand curled lightly near her chest. She looked peaceful, untouched by the noise of the world. I felt a gratitude so deep it nearly overwhelmed me. It's not just for her presence, but for the grace she carried. The way she had opened a door not only into her life, but into a new way of seeing my own. Later that day, as we walked barefoot along the shore, the cold water licking at our feet, she laughed when I tried to skip stones and failed miserably. She leaned down, picked up a smooth pebble, and handed it to me. "Try again," she said, and I did. The stone jumped once, then sank, but her laugh stayed with me. And maybe that's what it's about, I thought. Maybe love. This stage isn't about grand declarations or perfect throws. Maybe it's about trying again, about skipping stones even when they sink, about showing up with both hands open, hoping the other will take one and walk beside you through whatever. Tides may come. We stayed until the sky turned orange. Then we returned to the cottage, hearts a little fuller. The silence between us now completely transformed, not a lack of words, but the presence of something greater than words. And as I lay beside her that night, I thought, this isn't a second chance. It's a continuation. It's a love story that didn't start late, but exactly when it was meant to. Returning from the coast felt different than leaving for it. It wasn't a return to normal, nor was it the end of anything. It felt like something had gently shifted in the air between us, like the ground beneath our feet had steadied rather than changed. Evelyn and I rode in silence for most of the drive back, but it was the kind of silence that hummed with shared memory, the kind that didn't need music or chatter to fill the space. Her hand rested on her lap, occasionally brushing mine when we hit a bump or made a turn, and each time our skin touched, something warm and sure passed through me. When I glanced at her, she was looking out the window, her profile soft in the morning light, her lips faintly curled in what I could only describe as contentment. There were no grand declarations when we pulled into her driveway, no conversations about what this meant or where things were headed. Instead, she stepped out of the truck, looked back at me with a quiet smile, and said, "Tea later." I said yes, because of course it would always be yes. The following week was quiet in a new way. I still took on my regular job, some light plumbing across town, a few minor fence repairs, and one particularly grumpy cat owner who insisted her windowsills needed sanding to keep the energy flow balanced. But Evelyn was never far from my thoughts. She'd started texting me more during the day, short little messages. Photos of her garden, a question about whether I liked marmalade or strawberry jam, a blurry snapshot of a book cover at the library. I found myself replying more quickly than I used to. My phone never stayed untouched in my pocket for long. It was strange to be rediscovering excitement in something as simple as hearing from someone. But with Evelyn, nothing felt simple. It all felt layered, earned, sacred. One morning, I stopped by without planning to, something I had never done before unless we had arranged it. I brought a bag of fresh bagels from the bakery she liked downtown and 2 coffees. She opened the door in a robe and thick socks, her hair still damp from the shower, and blinked at me in amused surprise. "You come bearing carbs and caffeine," she said with a grin. "You must know the way to my heart." We ate on her back porch again, the garden alive with the hum of bees and the rustle of wind. After breakfast, we walked through the yard, her pointing out the plants she had tended since spring and me pretending to know the names of half of them. We stopped at a small patch of lavender and stood in silence as the scent rose between us. She turned to me then, unprompted, and asked, "Do you think love gets quieter as we age, or do we just learn how to listen to it better?" It was a question that didn't need an answer, and yet it stirred something in me. I thought about the love I had known in my past, loud, fast, hot-burning, and often short-lived. And then I looked at her, standing in her garden with the morning, sun in her hair and the calm in her gaze, and I knew the answer, at least for myself. "I think love becomes less about fireworks and more about foundation," I said. "Less about trying to impress, and more about trying to be present." That's what we were meant for all along. We sat beneath her fig tree that afternoon, and for the first time I told her about my past in more detail. Not just the surface-level facts, but the moments that had shaped me. The way my last relationship ended, not in betrayal or disaster, but in silence, the growing apart. Slowly fading light between 2 people who no longer reached for each other. Evelyn listened, her eyes never leaving mine, her hands folded in her lap like she was cradling the weight of my words. When I finished, she reached over and touched my arm. "Hey, you didn't fail," she said. "Sometimes the path just leads somewhere else." Her words felt like balm on a wound I hadn't realized still ached. I looked at her then, really looked, and realized how rare it was to be seen so completely by another person. To be heard not for entertainment, but for understanding. I wasn't used to it, and yet with her, it felt natural. Needed later that week, she invited me over for dinner again. This time it wasn't fancy, just roasted chicken and potatoes. A simple salad and a bottle of wine she'd been saving. She told me she'd bought it 3 years ago, thinking she'd open it when she had something to celebrate. "I didn't realize until today," she said as she poured it, "that peace is something worth celebrating too." We ate slowly, not because we were stalling, but because the moment felt full enough to stretch. She showed me some old records. Afterward, her favorites from her college years. We sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the sleeves and laughing at the hairstyles and cover art. One song came on that made her pause. A soft acoustic melody with lyrics that spoke of time, of weathered hearts, of learning to love with your whole self, even after the world had left a few marks. She didn't say anything, just leaned against me, closed her eyes, and let the music wrap around us. When I left that night, we stood at her door again, the porch light casting a soft halo around her. She stepped forward and pressed a kiss to my cheek. It wasn't passionate or performative, it was grounding, a kiss that said, "We're here, and this is real." I touched her hand before I turned to go, and for the first time I realized I was no longer questioning what we were. I didn't need a label. I didn't need a plan. I just needed her, and the quiet way she brought peace to the noise I didn't even know I'd been carrying. Driving home, I thought about how strange and beautiful it is that life offers these kinds of stories, ones you don't see coming. Ones that don't follow the script of youth or the rules of fairy tales, but instead build slowly, deliberately, with the kind of care that comes only from 2 people who have both known loss, who have both stood in the rain and still chosen to bloom. It struck me then that Evelyn wasn't just a part of my life now, she was becoming a chapter I would return to, a turning point. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a story I never thought I'd get to tell again. The seasons had begun their slow transition again. The mornings came cooler, the wind arriving with a sharpness that hinted at the shift from warmth to something more introspective. It was the kind of change you didn't notice all at once but gradually became aware of in the way light touched the walls differently, or how the leaves rustled like they had something private to say. Evelyn's garden had started shedding some of its bright colors, the petals of her marigolds softening into muted gold, the lavender losing its sharp scent in the morning chill. But it remained beautiful. Even in the decay, there was grace, and somehow that reminded me of her. We had reached a place where her home felt more familiar than my own. It was the place I stopped by after a long day just to breathe. The place where dinner didn't have to be planned, but still happened. Where conversations flowed as naturally as the kettle boiled. And one night, I showed up with a bag of groceries not out of duty, but instinct. She didn't ask me to cook, but when she came downstairs and saw me stirring a pot of soup, she just smiled, set the table, and lit a candle. It was quiet moments like these where we started building something not based on declarations, but on rhythm, on mutual gestures of peace. On that particular evening, I remember how the lights in her kitchen flickered slightly because of the storm brewing outside. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air smelled like it was near. We ate slowly, the soup steaming between us, the world outside bracing for water and wind. Evelyn looked across the table at me, her chin resting on one hand, and said, almost like she was thinking out loud, "It's strange how long I lived without this. It's not just the company, but the comfort. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make me feel like I have to perform." That struck me more deeply than I expected. I understood what she meant. For so much of my life, I had navigated relationships where being needed felt more like being tested. Where comfort was transactional, affection was given only when earned. But with her, there was no scoreboard, no game, just presence. And now, that presence had become part of me. That night, the storm did arrive. A full downpour, the kind that seemed to shake the trees and soak the earth in minutes. I helped her bring in the cushions from the porch furniture, and we stood under the awning afterward, watching the sky release everything it had been holding back. The rain became a kind of music, rhythmic and cleansing. We didn't talk much, just stood there, her shoulder brushing against mine. The scent of petrichor rising in waves. When the storm settled into a steady drizzle, she turned to me with a softness I'd come to know in her eyes when she was about to say something that mattered. "Have you ever thought about what it would look like to stay?" she asked. She didn't clarify the question. She didn't need to. I knew she meant more than just staying the night. She meant being part of something ongoing, rooted, shared. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know the answer, but because it felt too big to respond too casually. So I reached for her hand and gave it the slightest squeeze, letting the weight of my silence fill with affirmation. She nodded, almost to herself, as if she already understood. The next morning, the world felt washed clean. The air was cooler, the leaves glistened from the night's rain, and the sky was still heavy with soft gray clouds. I made breakfast while she was still upstairs, the smell of coffee and eggs pulling her slowly into the day. She emerged wearing that worn cardigan I'd come to associate with her at her most unguarded. Hair tousled, face relaxed, she looked at me like someone who had just woken from a dream and wasn't ready to let go of it. We ate on the porch again, wrapped in blankets, watching the occasional drop of water fall from the overhang. After breakfast, she pulled out an old photo album. It was one I hadn't seen before, different from the one she'd casually flipped through on earlier afternoons. This one was heavier, older, its pages thick and worn at the edges. She set it between us and opened it slowly, revealing pictures. From her childhood, her college years, early memories with her husband. She didn't narrate each photo, just paused on a few, her fingers gently tracing the edges. Then, without prompting, she started to tell me stories, not the kind she had rehearsed before. These were rawer, more revealing. Moments of loneliness, loss, the dreams she had shelved, the fears she had carried quietly. She told me about her struggles with feeling invisible in her 40s. How after Thomas passed, people stopped seeing her as a woman with wants and needs, and started treating her like someone who had already lived the important chapters. She hated that. The assumption that her story had ended. I listened, the kind of listening that requires you to sit with someone's truth without interrupting or softening it. When she finished, she closed the album gently and looked at me with eyes that held no expectation, just vulnerability. That's why that day in the garden, when I asked you that question, it wasn't really about love. Not at first. It was about whether I was still allowed to want it. I reached for her then, cupping her face in both hands, and leaned in just enough for our foreheads to touch. "You were never too old for love," I said quietly. "But you were far too valuable to be unseen." She closed her eyes at that. And for a moment, we stayed like that, foreheads together, hearts open, the morning unfolding around us like a blessing. It was the kind of closeness that didn't need to rush toward a conclusion. It just needed to exist. In the days that followed, I began bringing over more of my things. Not in a formal way, just slowly, subtly. A toolbox I didn't want to keep in the truck. A second toothbrush. A hoodie she kept accidentally forgetting to return. It wasn't cohabitation, not yet, but it was motion. It was a direction. We were both walking toward without panic. One evening, I noticed she had moved a few things around in her closet, cleared space on a shelf, left an empty drawer open. She didn't mention it. And neither did I, but when I placed my folded t-shirts inside that drawer later that week, something in my chest swelled, not with fear, but with belonging. She wasn't just letting me into her house, she was letting me into her life, and I was ready to stay. It was strange. It's the way a life could begin to shift shape without ever needing to make a sound. That's how it felt in those weeks that followed, the kind of change that doesn't ask for attention but instead arrives slowly, with the quiet assurance of a tide rising against the shore. I was spending more time at Evelyn's than anywhere else now. At first it was just a few extra evenings here and there, but soon it became more consistent. The kinds of nights where neither of us questioned my presence at her dinner table, or on the porch with her after sunset, or beside her in bed when the house finally fell quiet. What we were growing together wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was steady, patient, like a seedling allowed to bloom under the care of time and attention, not urgency. One morning I woke up before her. The sky outside her bedroom window was painted in soft pinks and oranges, and she lay beside me with her hand resting lightly on my chest. I stayed still for a long while, listening to her slow breathing, watching the way her lashes rested gently against her cheek. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about how we'd gotten here. I was thinking about how easily we'd arrived, how naturally something like this had taken root. A few months ago, I was simply the guy fixing her hose. Now I knew how she liked her tea, the specific shape she made with her hands when she was nervous, the exact sound of her laugh when it was real and unguarded. I'd memorized her quiet. Later that day, I returned to my apartment to collect a few more of my things. I hadn't been there in days. The air inside felt still, untouched, almost as though it had been waiting for me to make a decision I'd already made without realizing. I packed slowly, not with the intention of moving everything just yet, but enough to make staying at Evelyn's feel more like home and less like a visit. A few framed photos, the sweater she always stole when she was cold, my shaving kit, my books. When I returned to her house that evening, she didn't say anything when she saw the box in my hands. She just stepped aside and let me in. That was how she operated, not with grand gestures, but with space. With welcome that evening, we cooked together. It had become something of a shared ritual now. One of us would take the lead, the other would assist. She taught me how to roast vegetables just the way she liked them, crisp on the edges, soft in the center, and I taught her the shortcut to making perfect scrambled eggs with a splash of cream. We danced around each other in that kitchen like we had been doing it for years. There were no roles, no obligations, only rhythm. After dinner, we sat on the living room floor surrounded by the boxes I had brought. She began helping me sort through them, gently unwrapping a few of the old photos I had packed. One of them was of my father, taken when I was in my teens. I paused when I saw it, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. She noticed. "You miss him?" she asked, not with pity, but with understanding. I nodded. "Some days more than others," I replied. She reached over and took the frame from my hands, brushing her fingers lightly along the glass. "Tell me about him," she said. So I did. I told her about my childhood, about the way he used to hum old jazz tunes while fixing things around the house. How he taught me that showing up was more important than saying the right thing. I told her how he never pressured me to become anyone, but always reminded me to be someone I could be proud of. As I spoke, Evelyn listened with that same attentive silence that made me feel like every word mattered. When I finished, she placed the photo gently on the shelf next to her own, right beside one of her mother's old wedding pictures. The gesture was simple, but it meant something. It said he can be part of this home too. Later that night, we curled up on the couch beneath a thick blanket. The wind outside had picked up, rustling the last of the autumn leaves across the windows. Evelyn rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers tracing slow, thoughtful lines along my arm. "You know," she said softly, "there were years when I thought this kind of peace wasn't meant for me anymore. Not after everything. Not at this age." I turned to her, met her eyes. "And now?" I asked. She smiled, not brightly, but with depth. "Now, I think maybe I just hadn't found the right quiet yet, though he stayed like that for a long time." The only sounds, the wind outside and the soft hum of a jazz record she'd put on. There was no need to fill the space with more. We were already full. One Saturday morning, she surprised me. I had just come in from trimming some dead branches off one of her trees when she called me inside with a strange look on her face. "I want to show you something," she said. I followed her down the hall to a door I'd never noticed before, narrow and white, tucked between her linen closet and the back guest room. She opened it, revealing a set of stairs leading downward. "A basement. I've never really had a reason to open this up," she explained as we descended, "but I've been thinking maybe it's time." The basement was dusty, but not cluttered. It's mostly old furniture, some covered in sheets, boxes labeled with dates and names I didn't recognize. There was a workbench, a couple of lamps, and a wide-open corner that could be anything. "I was thinking," she began, her voice tentative, "that maybe this could be something for us. A space, not just storage. A project we do together." She looked at me then with something close to hope in her eyes. Not demand, not expectation, just the suggestion that she was willing to build something with me. Literally and figuratively, I felt that familiar warmth in my chest again. That feeling of being wanted in a way that wasn't about fixing things, but about being part of something new. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Let's do it." We spent the rest of that afternoon drawing up silly plans, her talking about a reading nook, me suggesting a small workshop space. It wasn't about what we would build exactly. It was the idea that we could build something at all, and that was the moment I knew, without doubt, that I wasn't just staying with Evelyn anymore. I was beginning again. With her. The basement project became more than just a renovation. It turned into a quiet metaphor for everything we were slowly building together. First we took it, day by day, clearing out old boxes, dusting off forgotten furniture, sorting through layers of Evelyn's past that had been sleeping beneath her home for decades. There was something intimate about the work, not because it was physically close, but because it required trust. Each item uncovered was a piece of her memory, and she invited me to witness it all. One dusty box held photo albums I hadn't seen before, candid shots of her and her husband in their early 30s, vacations, messy dinner tables, evenings by the fireplace. She didn't flinch showing them to me. There was no hesitation, no apology for having loved deeply before. "He was good to me," she said once, wiping off a frame before setting it on a shelf for donation. But that chapter ended. This is its own book entirely. We kept the basement's atmosphere cozy while working, soft instrumental music drifting down from her portable speaker. The scent of spiced candles filling the corners, mugs of coffee resting near toolboxes, and paint cans. She was more hands-on than I'd expected. She didn't just supervise or point-eyed, turn around and find her halfway. Through sanding an old bookcase or hauling a rug into the corner, she'd already mentally turned into her reading nook. watching her like that hair-pulled-back shirt, slightly stained with paint, face lit with purpose made something inside me settle. I had never seen aging look so vibrant, so alive with the possibility of becoming. Each time she stood up from a crouch or laughed at the stiffness in her knees, I thought, how foolish the world is to ever question whether love or desire has an expiration date. One afternoon, while installing new shelves on the west wall of the basement, Evelyn paused and glanced over at me. Her hands rested on her hips, cheeks flushed from the effort, and she said, "You know, I haven't felt this involved in anything in years." I looked up from the level I was holding and nodded. Neither have I. We didn't need to name what we were doing. It was enough to feel it. And the more we worked, the more that space transformed, bare cement walls giving way to warmth. Old forgotten relics traded for something we could claim as ours. By the end of the third week, the basement had become an extension of our rhythm, a blend of our choices, tastes, and comforts. It had my old tool cabinet in the corner and her velvet armchair near the window. Books she loved lined one wall, while the opposite wall bore a row of hooks for jackets and bags, practical and hers, in the way only Evelyn could make things. Practical feel elegant. Outside the basement, the town was starting to lean in too late. Autumn leaves gave in to their final blush before falling, and the smell of chimney smoke began to cling to the air. Evelyn's garden had retreated into its restful phase, the soil damp and the branches bare. We'd stopped trying to maintain every petal or bloom and let nature do what it was meant to. That surrender to time became another lesson. There was no resisting the rhythm of things, only learning how to live within them with grace. One Sunday morning, we drove out to a local flea market, not because we needed anything, but because Evelyn said she missed the feeling of discovery. We wandered between booths and tarps, sipping hot cider and pointing out ridiculous antiques we could never justify bringing home. At one table, she paused before a stack of old vinyl records, her fingers brushing lightly across the sleeves. She found one dusty, but in good shape, and handed it to me. It was a jazz album from the 1960s, the kind my father used to play. "This one feels like you," she said, and that simple sentence sat with me for the rest of the day. She wasn't just learning about me. She was seeing me, remembering the smallest parts, folding them into her world like they belonged. We brought the record home and played it that night in the basement. I sat on the small couch we'd squeezed between two shelves while Evelyn curled up beside me, under an old quilt. The music filled the space slowly, like light at dawn. As the notes wrapped around us, I felt her fingers find mine beneath the blanket. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The way her hand rested in mine said everything. I knew then that she didn't see me as a handyman or a fleeting comfort. She saw me as someone worth keeping, someone worth choosing again and again, even. In the quiet hours of the day, the topic of moving in fully came up, not with a conversation, but with a question. She had been sorting through her pantry one evening when she turned to me and asked, "Would you mind if I got you your own shelf?" It was the smallest, most unceremonious invitation, and yet it meant everything. I'd love that. I told her, and meant it more than she could know. That shelf soon held my favorite coffee, a few snacks I always forgot I liked until she reminded me, and a jar of mixed nuts she'd sneak into her coat pocket whenever we went on walks. Our world expanded like that, tiny gesture by tiny gesture. We started planning meals together for the week ahead. She printed out a calendar and scribbled notes on appointments, dinner ideas, reminders. On Thursday mornings, we went to the market. On Friday nights, we watched old movies we'd never seen before, pausing to talk about the cinematography or how people kissed differently on film back then. She laughed when I insisted on calling our Sunday pancake tradition pancake protocol. I loved how she made the bed like she was tucking in a secret. I loved how she read aloud from her books, changing her voice for different characters. I loved how she reached for me in the middle of the night. Not out of fear or longing, but out of instinct, and in those quiet hours before sleep. I would think back to the moment I first walked into her yard, fixing her garden hose, wearing an old work shirt, not knowing she would unearth parts of me I had packed away long ago. Not knowing that one question, "Do you think I'm too old for love?" would lead to a story that neither of us had planned to tell. But here we were, chapter after chapter. Writing it together, there was something unspoken about the way the house had shifted. Not just the physical changes, the extra shelf in the pantry, the slippers by the door that were unmistakably mine, the hooks near the entryway now holding 2 coats instead of 1, but a kind of warmth that settled into the very foundation. It was as if the walls themselves had exhaled, no longer echoing with silence, but carrying the soft imprint of shared laughter, overlapping footsteps, and the rustle of pages read aloud in the evenings. Evelyn had always kept her space tidy and deliberate, every item with a place, every corner softly touched by her aesthetic. But now, a different kind of intentionality was taking root. Not one built on control or preservation, but on blending, adapting. 2 lives beginning to share the same rhythm, the same calendar, the same weather forecast. And it was in that slow and quiet interweaving that something profound was taking shape. Trust. Not just in each other, but in the idea that maybe love wasn't just a feeling, but a space you built, together brick by brick. That month, Evelyn decided she wanted to repaint the guest bedroom. "It's too cold," she said one morning as we were making the bed, sunlight falling through the window in streaks of gold and dust. "It feels like a waiting room, not a room for stories." So we picked out swatches, debated between shades, with whimsical names like warm almond and harvest linen, and eventually landed on a soft, buttery hue that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. We spent the better part of a weekend sanding the walls, laying down tarps, and taking turns with the roller. She wore one of my old button-ups as a smock, sleeves rolled to her elbows, streaks of paint in her hair and across her cheek by the time the second coat went up. I remember stopping mid-stroke just to look at her, her brows furrowed in concentration, her hands steady, her lips slightly parted as she hummed along to the old soul playlist drifting from her phone. I didn't say anything in that moment, but my heart tucked it away. It's funny how falling in love often happens not in crescendos but in brushstrokes, in small and deliberate movements layered over time. Later that night, after we had cleaned up and showered and settled onto the couch with steaming mugs of tea, Evelyn looked at me and said something I hadn't expected. "Sometimes," she began, fingers curled around her cup, "I still feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like this is too good, too easy, and any minute now something will come along to remind me it's all temporary." I didn't interrupt her. I let her keep going. "It's not you," she continued. "It's not anything you've done. It's just, after a certain age, you stop believing in permanence. You learn to expect the shift, the loss. Even when it's quiet, you brace for noise." I reached over and took her hand, not to fix, not to reassure, but to simply hold space for her honesty. And after a few moments, I said, "Maybe it's not about trying to silence that fear. Maybe it's about having someone to sit with when it shows up." Her shoulders softened at that, and she didn't say it. But her silence told me I'd answered the question beneath the question. The next morning brought a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. As the kettle whistled and the sun filtered through the curtains, I felt a calmness in my chest that didn't feel borrowed or fragile. It felt earned. And that day, I started putting more things away, not just my belongings, but my old ideas about love. The timelines I used to cling to, the idea that certain chapters had to end before others could begin. Being with Evelyn wasn't about rewriting my past or erasing hers. It was about making space on the page we were now sharing. That week, Evelyn invited her sister over for dinner. It was the first time I'd meet anyone from her family, and though I didn't say much about it, I found myself quietly nervous. I cleaned the kitchen twice, ironed the tablecloth, asked too many questions about what wine her sister liked. "Evelyn." Jess smiled and told me not to worry. "She'll love you," she said with the kind of certainty that didn't need convincing. Her sister, Claire, arrived right on time with a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. She hugged Evelyn tightly, her eyes scanning the room and then landing on me. "So," she said, her tone light but curious, "you're the guy who fixed the hose." I laughed a bit sheepishly and nodded, guilty as charged. Dinner was easy, surprisingly so. Claire was sharp, warm, and clearly protective of her sister, but not in a way that was overbearing. She asked good questions, listened thoughtfully, and even teased Evelyn about her terrible singing voice when an old Diana Ross song came on. There was a moment near the end of the meal when she looked between the two of us and said, "I haven't seen her this alive in years." Evelyn blushed, brushed it off with a sip of wine, but I could see it meant something to her, that someone else had noticed, that it was real. After Claire left, we stood at the sink washing dishes together, the hum of the night wrapping itself gently around us. Evelyn was quiet, her hands methodical as she rinsed and passed. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "Thank you for being someone I don't have to explain myself to." I looked over, water dripping from my fingers, and said, "Thank you for being someone who never asked me to be anyone else." In the weeks that followed, our lives continued to fold into one another in ways that were both subtle and profound. We found our rhythm not in grand gestures, but in the spaces between them, and shared glances across the grocery store. In synchronized footsteps during our evening walks, in the way we now moved through her home like it had always been ours. I began to realize that what we were building wasn't just a relationship. It was a home, a place where pasts were respected, presents were cherished, and futures didn't need to be feared. We hadn't labeled anything, hadn't made declarations, hadn't drawn lines around what this was, but we knew. Our bones and our breath and the way our hands found each other under the table when no one was looking, and sometimes that knowing was enough. By late November, the house had taken on a new kind of stillness, the kind that wasn't empty, but instead full of something settled. The leaves had fallen, the garden gone quiet, and the mornings brought with them a chill that wrapped around the porch like a shawl. Evelyn started lighting candles earlier in the day, not for light but for comfort. And we found ourselves lingering more over coffee, over conversations, over the silence that now felt like a friend. One afternoon, while sorting through some of her old vinyl records for the basement, she handed me a weathered envelope. "My husband wrote this to me once," she said, not with sadness, but with a kind of reverence, before he passed. Kept it, not to hold on, but to remind myself what love looked like back then. She didn't need to read it aloud. Just sharing it with me was enough. I understood then that Evelyn wasn't trying to replace a past. She was letting me add to her present. And that's when it truly struck me. Love, especially at this stage in life, wasn't about burning passion or loud declarations. It was about being brave enough to begin again, knowing full well what it might cost, and choosing to begin anyway. December arrived with its own hush. Not the chaotic kind filled with holidays and rushing, but a gentler pace, more introspective, more deliberate. Evelyn and I had fallen into an unspoken rhythm by then, where each day began with shared silence over coffee and ended with warmth, sometimes laughter, sometimes reading side by side, sometimes just the comfort of her hand resting on mine, while the world outside our windows moved on without urgency. One evening, snow began to fall. Not the kind that disrupts, but the kind that floats quiet, persistent, and beautiful. We stood at the window watching it blanket the trees and rooftops. And Evelyn, without looking away, said softly, "I used to think the winters would be the loneliest time for me. They were for a while. But this year, I feel ... different." I didn't need to ask what she meant. I could feel it too. We weren't rushing toward anything anymore. There was no pressure to define what we were or to predict where it was going. We had grown something strong in the quiet, in the real, and in the everyday choosing of each other. And as we stood there, two people who once thought their most meaningful chapters were behind them, we understood. This was the love story neither of us expected. Both of us needed. The new year arrived not with fanfare, but with a gentle sense of continuation. We didn't throw a party, didn't stay up until midnight with champagne or countdowns. Instead, Evelyn and I spent that evening, like many others, on the couch beneath the quilt we now both claimed, jazz humming softly. In the background, her feet tucked under my leg and her head resting gently on my shoulder. When the clock struck 12, we were still awake, but quiet, listening to the far-off sound of fireworks blooming across town. She looked up at me, not with excitement, but with the kind of peace that comes when you know the life You've built as one you no longer want to escape from. Happy New Year, she whispered, and I kissed her forehead and said it back, thinking to myself how surreal it was to be so deeply grateful for something I never saw coming by mid-January. The basement was no longer just a project. It had become a sanctuary. The room now reflected who we were together, calm, comfortable, lived in, and full of little reminders of how far we'd come. The walls had been adorned with a few framed photos, a mix of her past and my present, her old cat curled up in a sunbeam, a picture I'd taken of her laughing at a joke I had long since forgotten, one of us at the flea market looking surprised. The moment the camera went off, there were books we had both read and some we promised each other we'd get to soon. And in the corner, a lamp we found at a second-hand shop glowed warm and low. The space was quiet but alive, and sometimes I would sit down there alone, just to breathe in the proof that people could rebuild. And it wasn't just the house or the routines that changed. Something in Evelyn began to shift, to not in a dramatic way, but in layers, like petals unfolding after a long, dormant winter. She laughed more easily, even when it was just at herself. She began to speak about the future, not in vague hopes, but in real, grounded plans. One afternoon, she showed me a list she'd made. It wasn't grand or filled with bucket list items, just a few things she'd always meant to do. Take a painting class, visit a lighthouse, try kayaking, just once, even if she hated it. At the bottom she'd written, spend more Sundays with you. When I read that, I didn't say anything. Just reached over and kissed her hand. There was one Sunday in particular that still sits with me. We had been out for a drive along. The coastline, winding roads, curving through cliffs and trees, ocean glittering beside us like a quiet witness. We pulled over at one of those scenic lookouts, not because we needed a view, but because she said she wanted to feel the wind on her face. She stepped out of the car, walked to the edge, and just stood there with her arms crossed against the cold, her eyes closed. I joined her a moment later, and we stood in silence until she finally turned to me and said, "Do you remember the first thing I asked you? About whether I was too old for love?" I nodded. Of course I remembered. How could I forget? That single question had cracked open the door to everything that followed. I think, she continued, back then, I didn't really believe you when you said I wasn't. Not entirely. I wanted to. I hoped to, but part of me was still carrying. All the voices that said love had an expiration date. If it didn't look like a fairy tale by a certain age, it wasn't meant to happen. But I know better now. You've shown me better. I took her hand then, not to respond with words, but with presence. And together, we stood at the edge of that overlook. Wind rushing past us like time itself, and I knew we weren't just looking out at the view, we were looking forward. As winter gave way to early spring, something in the rhythm of our life shifted again, not dramatically, but like the faint scent of blossoms in the air before anything's in full bloom. We started sleeping with the windows cracked open, letting the cool night air roll in over the sheets. Evelyn had started using a new journal, one with a brown leather cover and a ribbon bookmark. I caught her writing in it some mornings before I woke up, her brow gently furrowed, a small smile playing at her lips. And though I never asked to read it, I knew those pages were filled with pieces of a life she'd once thought was over, but now understood was simply transforming. We never moved in officially. There was no ceremony, no key exchange, no boxes piled by the door. It just happened. My things made their way into her drawers. Her refrigerator began to carry both our preferences. Our nights began to blur together in a way that made leaving feel unnecessary. Her neighbors, once cautious observers, now greeted me like an extension of her, offering smiles, waves, the occasional joke. The world had accepted what we'd known for months, that something real had taken root. And neither of us planned on walking away from it, and so here we are. Months past that garden hose. Past the days of awkward small talk and cautious glances. Past the questions about worthiness and age and timing. We didn't find love by chasing it. We found it by staying, by showing up, by tending to each other. Like the garden she once thought she'd abandoned gently, patiently, with care. If you're still watching this, maybe you're like Evelyn was. Maybe you've asked yourself if your time has passed, if love has overlooked you, if there's still room for new beginnings. I'm here to tell you because Evelyn reminded me there is. Always. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen, if this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.